Dr. Adrian Lee adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he examined the rows of ceremonial artifacts laid out on the weathered oak table. The small museum on the edge of the reservation was modest but meticulously maintained, its pine shelves lined with centuries-old pottery and earth tones, intricately woven baskets that still held their shape after generations, and beaded jewelry that caught the late afternoon light filtering through dust-specked windows. Most of the items were centuries old, their craftsmanship speaking to countless hours of dedication and inherited skill. Yet one piece drew his attention more than the others. A small bone flute, no larger than his forearm, its yellowed surface carved with intricate spiraling patterns and strange angular symbols that seemed to shift in the shadows. "That one," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper as he gestured to the flute, unable to tear his eyes away from the mesmerizing patterns. "It's beautiful. What's the story behind it?" Across the table, Elder Henry Black Elk, a wiry man with sharp, weathered features and eyes that could pierce steel, stopped polishing a clay pot with his worn leather cloth. He looked up slowly, his practiced movements stilling as his gaze fell upon the flute. His eyes narrowed, crow's feet deepening at the corners. "It's not just a story," Henry said, his voice firm as granite, each word deliberate and heavy with warning. "That flute should not be played, ever." The last word carried a weight that seemed to drop into the hushed atmosphere of the museum, like a stone into still water. Adrian's lips curled into what he hoped was a polite, professional smile, though his heart quickened at the elder's tone. "I understand, but could you explain? I'm documenting the history of these artifacts for the university archive. Knowing the context would really help complete my research." He tried to keep his voice steady, scholarly, despite the growing excitement he felt at the prospect of uncovering something truly unique. Henry's expression didn't soften. If anything, the lines in his face seemed to deepen as he leaned back in his wooden chair, the ancient joints creaking as he crossed his arms across his chest. His silver-streaked hair caught the dying sunlight, creating a momentary halo effect that made him look otherworldly. "That flute," he said, each word measured, "was used in an old ceremony to call the Wendigo." The name hung in the air like frost smoke, seeming to drop the temperature in the room by several degrees. Adrian's curiosity sharpened to a knife's edge, his fingers itching to reach for his leather-bound notebook. "The Wendigo?" he prompted, trying to keep his voice casual as he pulled out his notebook and uncapped his fountain pen. "Isn't that a kind of cautionary tale? A creature representing greed and excess in traditional folklore?" His academic tone felt hollow even to his own ears. Henry's gaze darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, though the sun hadn't moved behind its cloud cover. "It is not a tale, Doctor. It is real. That flute was made to summon it. A last-ditch effort to confront and banish the spirit when it plagued our ancestors during the darkest winters. But to summon a Wendigo," he leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is to invite its hunger into your world. You cannot control it, only hope to survive it. And few have." Adrian hesitated, then nodded, trying to maintain his professional demeanor, despite the chill that ran down his spine. "Fascinating. I'll make sure the flute is handled with appropriate care and respect." Henry's lips pressed into a thin line, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. "The best care," he said with finality, "is to leave it alone. Some things are meant to stay buried in the past." That evening, Adrian returned to his temporary lodgings, a small cabin provided by the tribal council that sat at the edge of the pine forest. The air was crisp with early autumn, the stars brilliant against the ink-black sky, seeming to pulse with an intensity he'd never noticed in the city. Despite the elder's warnings, or perhaps because of them, Adrian's thoughts kept circling back to the flute like moths to a flame. He had studied countless artifacts during his 15-year career, but this one felt different. There was a weight to it, a sense of mystery that seemed to hum in his bones. Pouring himself a generous measure of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the lamplight, Adrian sat at the small desk where he had spread his notes and sketches. The flute rested in the center, its polished surface gleaming under the warm glow of the desk lamp. The carvings seemed deeper in the artificial light, creating shadows that danced along its length. He turned it over in his hands, his fingertips tracing the intricate patterns. Each symbol seemed to pulse with a faint warmth, though he told himself it was just the whiskey working its way through his system. "One little note won't hurt," he muttered to himself, the whiskey burning pleasantly in his throat as he brought the flute to his lips. "For research purposes." He blew gently, producing a high, thin note that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, reverberating in his chest like a second heartbeat. A shiver ran down his spine, but he brushed it off as excitement. He tried another note, then another, his fingers finding positions that felt unnaturally familiar, weaving a simple melody that seemed to draw itself out of his subconscious. The sound was haunting, almost mournful, and it sent a strange thrill through him that was equal parts exhilaration and dread. Adrian set the flute down, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, rattling the cabin's windows with increasing intensity. He took another long sip of whiskey and told himself it was just his imagination, just the natural sounds of an unfamiliar place. But in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Henry's whispered warnings he couldn't quite ignore. By morning, the first signs of trouble began to surface like corpses rising in a flood. A rancher on the reservation reported several sheep missing, their sturdy pen broken open as if something massive had smashed through it from the outside. Tracks were found in the dirt, massive clawed footprints that no known animal could have made, the soil compressed as if under enormous weight. Adrian heard the whispers when he visited the museum later that day, his head still slightly fuzzy from the previous night's whiskey. Villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their voices hushed, but carrying notes of fear he couldn't ignore. Henry was there, pacing near the entrance like a caged animal. He stopped abruptly when he saw Adrian, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made Adrian take an involuntary step back. "Did you touch the flute?" Henry demanded, closing the distance between them in 3 quick strides. Adrian stiffened, his collar suddenly too tight. "I may have examined it closely," he admitted, finding himself unable to meet the elder's penetrating gaze. "Why?" Henry's expression turned grim, the lines in his face deepening like cracks in dry earth. "You played it." It wasn't a question. Adrian's stomach dropped like a stone. I might have tested it. Just a few notes. But nothing happened." The words sounded hollow, even as he spoke them. "Something always happens," Henry snapped, his voice sharp as breaking ice. "You just haven't seen it yet. The hunger has already begun." The village's unease deepened like a wound festering, spreading through the community as more livestock disappeared without trace. By the 3rd night, the whispers turned into screams that echoed through the valley. A young man, Lucas Red Cloud, had gone missing while walking home from his evening shift at the general store. His mother described hearing a terrible cry in the distance, followed by an unnatural silence that seemed to swallow all other sounds. Henry called an emergency meeting in the community center, his voice echoing through the tense crowd gathered under fluorescent lights that seemed too harsh, too modern for the ancient terror they were facing. "The Wendigo has been summoned," he said, his tone heavy with the weight of generations of knowledge. "Its hunger will not stop unless we banish it. We must act now, before more are taken." "How do we banish it?" someone asked from the back of the room, their voice trembling like a leaf in winter wind. Henry's gaze swept the room like a searchlight, landing on Adrian with the weight of judgment. "The one who summoned it must lead the ritual. It is the only way. Adrian felt the blood drain from his face as all eyes turned to him. Me? I don't even know what's happening. I'm not prepared for this. You must take responsibility, Henry said firmly, his voice carrying no room for argument. The Wendigo feeds on greed, recklessness, and guilt. You have brought it here with your disregard for our warnings. You must be the one to send it back. Henry explained the ritual that night, gathering sacred herbs that filled the air with sharp, clean scents, a ceremonial drum that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and a bundle of cedar branches that crackled with energy. The flute was the key, he said, as it had been during the old ceremonies when their ancestors faced similar darkness. Adrian's task was to play a melody that would lure the Wendigo to a sacred clearing, where the elders would perform the ancient banishment rite. It will come for you, Henry warned, his eyes reflecting the lamplight like twin flames. Do not stop playing, no matter what you see or hear. The moment the music stops, we all die. Adrian's hands shook as he accepted the flute, its surface now seeming to pulse with a cold energy that made his fingers ache. He had no choice but to trust the elder. The alternative was unthinkable. They set out at dusk, the clearing bathed in the faint, sickly glow of a waxing moon that seemed to hang too low in the sky. Henry and 2 other elders prepared the space with practiced movements, scattering sacred herbs that released sharp, ancient scents and drawing symbols in the dirt that seemed to glow faintly in the gathering darkness. Adrian stood at the edge of the clearing, clutching the flute so tightly his knuckles turned white as bone. Begin, Henry said, his voice low and steady. Adrian raised the flute to his lips with trembling hands and started to play. The notes wavered at first, uncertain as a newborn's steps, but soon the melody flowed from some deep, dark place in his subconscious, weaving through the trees like a living thing. The air grew colder, frost forming on the leaves despite the season, and the forest seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of something ancient and terrible. Then came the sound, a distant, guttural cry that sent shivers down Adrian's spine and made his teeth ache. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the trees swayed as if something massive was moving through them, something that didn't belong in this world. "Keep playing!" Henry shouted, his voice nearly lost in the rising wind. Adrian obeyed, his fingers flying over the flute's surface as if possessed. The Wendigo emerged from the shadows like a nightmare taking form, a towering figure of bone and sinew. Its skin stretched too tight over an impossible frame. Its eyes glowed like dying stars, ancient and hungry, and its antlers scraped the branches above as it moved with a horrifying grace that defied its massive size. Its maw opened to reveal rows of jagged teeth, each one longer than Adrian's hand, and its breath frosted the air with the smell of decay. The elders began to chant in their ancient tongue, their voices rising in unison to create harmonies that seemed to pierce the veil between worlds. The Wendigo's gaze locked onto Adrian, and it let out a deafening roar that shook leaves from the trees and made the ground tremble. It lunged toward him, its claws outstretched and gleaming in the moonlight. Adrian's breath hitched in his throat, but he didn't stop playing. The melody faltered for a moment, and the creature hesitated, its form swaying as if caught between worlds, neither fully here nor fully there. "Louder," Henry commanded, his voice carrying the authority of generations. Summoning every ounce of courage he possessed, Adrian poured his fear and guilt into the music, letting it flow through him like a river of sound. The Wendigo's movements slowed, its form flickering like a dying flame in the wind. The elders' chants grew louder, the air crackling with energy that made Adrian's hair stand on end. With a final, piercing note that seemed to split the night itself, the Wendigo let out a shriek that shook the earth beneath their feet. Its form shattered like brittle ice, dissolving into a swirl of ash and shadow that vanished into the void between worlds. The forest fell silent, even the wind dying away to nothing. Adrian collapsed to his knees, the flute slipping from his nerveless fingers, to land softly in the frost-covered grass. Henry placed a weathered hand on his shoulder, his expression solemn but relieved. "It is done," the elder said, his voice gentle now, almost kind. "But remember this, Doctor. Respect the stories of the land. They are more than just tales. They are warnings written in blood and bone, passed down through generations for a reason." Adrian nodded, his chest heavy with a mix of relief and regret that he suspected would never fully leave him. As he stood on shaking legs and looked around the darkened forest, now seeming somehow both more familiar and more alien than before, he realized he had been given more than a lesson. He had been given a glimpse into a world that existed alongside his own, one that demanded respect and carried consequences for those who ignored its warnings. And he would never forget it, just as he would never forget the sound of the bone flute's song, echoing in his dreams until the day he died. Tom Ridge tightened the straps on his well-worn gear as the morning light filtered through the dense forest canopy, casting dappled shadows that danced across the forest floor. The towering pines loomed above like ancient sentinels, their massive trunks disappearing into the mist that hung in the air. Their branches swayed gently in the crisp autumn breeze, needles rustling with a sound like distant whispers. A faint mist curled around the trunks like ghostly fingers, giving the forest an ethereal, almost otherworldly quality that made the hair on the back of Tom's neck stand on end. "All right, buddy," he muttered to himself, his breath visible in the cool morning air. "Just another day." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, as if the forest itself knew they were a lie. As the park ranger for this remote stretch of wilderness, Tom was well acquainted with solitude. His cabin, a sturdy structure built in the 1950s, was miles from the nearest town of Pine Creek, population 847. His duties ranged from monitoring wildlife populations to ensuring hikers respected the marked trails, though fewer came these days. The locals called this place the Forest of Voices for reasons that had been shrouded in mystery and folklore for generations, passed down in hushed tones over campfires and at family gatherings. He'd heard the stories growing up, how the wind carried whispers of the ancestors, how the trees could speak warnings if you listened closely, how people who ventured too deep sometimes never returned. As a younger man, he had dismissed it all as tall tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But lately, those whispers felt too real to ignore. They crept into his dreams, echoed in the spaces between his thoughts, and seemed to follow him through the trees like invisible companions. Tom's radio crackled to life with a burst of static as he loaded his pack into the Forest Service Jeep, the sound sharp and jarring in the morning stillness. "Dispatch to Ridge," came Sarah Martinez's familiar voice, tinged with concern. She'd been manning the dispatch desk for 15 years, and her tone told him something was wrong before she even delivered the message. Tom grabbed the receiver, his calloused fingers wrapping around the cool plastic. "Go ahead." "We've got a report of missing campers near Pine Hollow. A couple of college kids, 3 or 4 from the state university. Haven't checked in with their families since last night. Parents are worried sick. Think you can look into it?" Tom frowned, his eyes automatically drawn to the forest's depths, where the mist seemed to thicken. Pine Hollow was deep within the Forest of Voices, a place most locals avoided unless they were thrill seekers or skeptics trying to disprove the legends. It was the kind of spot that attracted people who didn't know better, or didn't want to know better. "On it," he replied, trying to keep the apprehension out of his voice. "Any details on their last known location?" "They were supposed to camp near the old fire tower," Sarah responded. "You know the spot." Tom did know it. It was exactly where he wouldn't want to be after dark. The trail to Pine Hollow was narrow and overgrown, requiring Tom to leave his Jeep at an old logging turnout. He moved through the underbrush with practiced ease, his boots crunching against the leaf-strewn path that wound between the ancient trees. The deeper he went, the quieter the forest became, as if something was gradually muting the natural sounds of the wilderness. Birds stopped chirping, small animals ceased their rustling, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath, creating an unnatural pocket of silence that pressed against his eardrums. By the time he reached the campsite, the air was unnaturally still, heavy with an expectant tension that made it difficult to breathe. The remnants of a campfire smoldered in the center of the clearing, thin wisps of smoke rising like ghostly fingers into the air. Around it lay scattered belongings that told a story of hasty departure. A half-empty water bottle tipped on its side, contents slowly dripping onto the earth. A torn sleeping bag that looked as if it had been clawed open from the inside. And a phone with a cracked screen that still displayed a half-written text message. "Something's wrong. We can hear." Tom crouched to examine the fire, his experienced eyes taking in details others might miss. It had burned out hours ago, but the ashes were still warm, suggesting the campers had been here recently. The arrangement of the stones around the pit was disturbed, as if someone or something had stumbled through it in a panic. "Where the hell did you go?" he muttered, scanning the area for signs of which direction they might have fled. The words seemed to hang in the air, absorbed by the unnatural silence. A faint rustling drew his attention, too deliberate to be the wind. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving to the flashlight on his belt, though the morning sun still filtered through the canopy above. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding flat and muffled in the dense air. No response came from the forest, just the sound of the wind, or was it? It carried a low, melodic whisper, almost like voices murmuring in unison, the words just beyond the edge of comprehension. Tom's chest tightened as childhood memories of his grandmother's warnings flooded back. "The forest speaks to those who listen, Tommy, but some messages aren't meant for mortal ears." The whispers grew louder as he followed the trail deeper into the forest, leaving the relative safety of the clearing behind. They seemed to swirl around him like autumn leaves, echoing off the trees in an unsettling cadence that made his skin crawl. At first he tried to rationalize it, as the wind playing tricks on his ears, but the words were unmistakable, carrying a clarity that no natural phenomenon could explain. "Turn back." Tom froze, his boots rooted to the earth as if the soil itself held him in place. The voice was clear, almost conversational, yet it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. He spun in a circle, his flashlight cutting through the mist that had grown thicker without him noticing. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice breaking the silence like a stone through ice. Only the forest replied, the whispers now faint and scattered, like the dying echoes of a conversation just out of reach. His grip on the flashlight tightened until his knuckles turned white as he pressed forward, his instincts screaming at him to leave but his duty pulling him onward. 20 years of service meant something. He couldn't abandon people who might need his help, no matter how much his primitive brain was telling him to run. He found the first body an hour later, in a small depression between two ancient pines. It was a young man, probably a freshman or sophomore, his face pale and frozen in an expression of sheer terror that made Tom's blood run cold. His limbs were contorted at unnatural angles, as though he'd been reaching for something that wasn't there, or trying to escape something only he could see. Around him, the earth was deeply disturbed, claw marks gouging the dirt as though he'd tried to fight against being dragged by some tremendous force. But there were no tracks, no signs of what had caused such violence. Tom knelt beside the body, his stomach churning as he noted the details with professional detachment. No visible wounds, no blood, no signs of animal attack, just fear etched into every line of the man's face, his eyes wide and staring at something in the canopy above. He grabbed his radio, his voice unsteady despite years of training. "Dispatch, this is Ridge. I've got a body near Pine Hollow. Young male, approximately 20. Send backup immediately. Over." Static crackled in reply, the white noise seeming to form words just beyond understanding. He repeated the message, but the radio remained silent, the static growing louder until he had to clip it back to his belt. "Damn it," Tom muttered, rising to his feet. The air had grown colder, his breath forming clouds in front of his face despite the morning sun. A faint noise drew his attention from deeper in the forest. It sounded like laughter, high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the trees in a way that made his skin crawl. He rose slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears like a drum. "Who's there?" he called again, his voice stronger than he felt. The laughter stopped abruptly, cut off as if someone had thrown a switch. In its place came the same chilling whisper, closer now, almost at his ear. "Turn back." As dusk began to fall, the forest grew darker, the towering pines casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach for him like grasping hands. Tom's flashlight flickered, its beam cutting through the oppressive gloom that pressed in from all sides. He found more signs of a struggle, torn fabric snagged on branches like forgotten flags, a trail of disturbed leaves leading toward a narrow ravine that shouldn't have been there. He knew these woods, and this geological feature had never existed before. He followed it, his footsteps cautious on the increasingly treacherous ground. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, their words blending into an incomprehensible hum that made his teeth ache. Then he saw her, and his heart nearly stopped. A young woman stood at the edge of the ravine, her back to him, swaying slightly, as if listening to music only she could hear. Her hair was tangled with leaves and twigs, her clothes muddy and torn, as if she'd been running through the undergrowth. She moved with an unnatural rigidity, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Miss?" Tom called, his voice gentle but firm, years of training taking over. "Are you all right?" She didn't respond, continuing her gentle swaying. He stepped closer, his hand outstretched. "It's okay. I'm here to help. I'm a park ranger." The woman turned slowly, moving with a jerky, mechanical motion that seemed wrong on a fundamental level. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he saw her face. Her eyes were hollow, literally empty, her face gaunt and pale as paper. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, the whispers poured out, louder and more insistent, a chorus of voices speaking in languages both ancient and unknown. "Turn back." Before he could react, she stepped backward with the same artificial motion, disappearing into the ravine as if pulled by invisible hands. Tom scrambled to the edge, shining his flashlight down into the darkness. The ravine was deep, its rocky sides slick with moss that shouldn't have been able to grow in such darkness. He couldn't see the bottom through the thick mist that filled the chasm, but the whispers rose from its depths like steam, filling the air with their eerie melody. Shaking, he backed away, his mind racing to process what he'd seen. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. The stories he'd dismissed for years now felt all too real, too immediate. The Forest of Voices wasn't just a name. It was a warning, written in disappearances and deaths that stretched back through generations. Tom returned to the campsite, his nerves frayed to breaking point. He lit a fire, hoping the warmth and light would keep whatever was out there at bay. As he sat by the flames, the whispers seemed to fade temporarily, replaced by the familiar crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves. He tried the radio again, but only static answered, punctuated by what sounded like distant screams. But the reprieve was short-lived. The fire dimmed without warning, as though the air itself was draining its energy. Shadows flickered at the edges of the clearing, moving against the wind, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "You should not have come." Tom rose to his feet, his hand moving to the flare gun on his belt. It was his last resort, a beacon that might draw help if there was anyone left to see it. "What do you want?" he shouted into the darkness, his voice steady despite his fear. The shadows coalesced, forming a figure that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the whispers. It stood just beyond the firelight, its shape indistinct but menacing, a darkness deeper than the night around it. Multiple voices emerged from it, speaking in unison with a sound like rustling leaves and cracking bones. "Leave this place," the voices commanded, the words carrying the weight of centuries. Tom fired the flare, the bright red light cutting through the darkness like a wound. The figure recoiled, dissolving into the shadows with a sound like 1,000 whispers screaming in pain, but the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, more chaotic, the words blending into a deafening roar that threatened to shatter his sanity. By dawn, the forest was silent again, but it was a silence that felt final, absolute. Tom emerged from the trees, his face pale and his body trembling from more than just the cold. The rescue team met him at the trailhead, their questions rapid and concerned, but he could only shake his head, the whispers still echoing in his mind. "There's something out there," he said, his voice hoarse from screaming. "Something that doesn't want us here. Something that's always been here." The authorities recovered the body he'd found and declared the area off-limits pending investigation. Officially, the deaths were attributed to an animal attack, the missing students added to the long list of disappearances that plagued the region. But Tom knew better. The Forest of Voices was alive, ancient and aware, and it would not forgive those who ignored its warnings. Back at his cabin, Tom stared at the dense woods that surrounded his home of 20 years. The whispers still lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the forest's warning. He knew he should leave, knew the forest had shown him more mercy than it had shown others. But as he packed his belongings, the whispers changed, becoming almost gentle, almost welcoming. The forest had chosen him as its witness, its guardian. He would stay, but not to protect people from the forest, to protect the forest from people, to pass on the warning that he now understood was as old as the trees themselves. Turn back. Some places aren't meant for human feet, some voices aren't meant for human ears, and some warnings should never be ignored. The land had cracked open under the unrelenting sun, deep fissures spreading through the parched soil like veins of desperation. Each day brought new breaks in the earth, as if the ground itself was crying out in pain. The drought had withered every stalk of corn in the community fields, turned the medicine gardens to dust, and dried up every well on the reservation, leaving the community teetering on the edge of survival. The elders said it was the worst drought in living memory, worse even than the great dry spell of 1954 that their grandparents still spoke of in hushed tones. 13-year-old Ayana watched her younger brother Koda crouch near the dry riverbed that had once been the lifeblood of their community. His small hands sifted through the sun-baked mud, searching for even the faintest trace of moisture in the cracked earth. The sight made her heart ache. At 8 years old, he was too young to understand the full gravity of their situation, but old enough to feel the weight of fear that hung over their community like a heavy blanket. "Come on, Koda," Ayana called, her voice hoarse from thirst and the ever-present dust that filled the air. "Mom's waiting." The words scratched her throat, a constant reminder of their dwindling water supplies. Koda looked up, his round face streaked with dirt and hope. The summer sun had darkened his skin and lightened his hair, making him look older than his years. "Do you think the rain will ever come back?" he asked, his voice small, but filled with the kind of trust that only children can maintain in the face of disaster. Ayana didn't answer. She couldn't bring herself to voice the truth she'd overheard in the elders' conversations, their whispered fears carrying through thin walls late at night. If the rain didn't come soon, the reservation would have to be abandoned. Their people would be scattered, forced to leave the land they had called home for generations. The thought of it made her stomach twist into knots. That night, as Ayana lay in her narrow bed listening to the creaking of their old house settling in the cooling air, the wind carried a new sound to her ears, a low melodic hum, like a distant song that seemed to resonate with something deep inside her bones. She sat upright, her heartbeat quickening as the strange melody wrapped around her consciousness. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, enveloping her like a warm blanket on a cold winter morning. "Ayana," the voice whispered, soft as the rustle of cottonwood leaves in a spring breeze. "Come." The voice called to something ancient in her blood, a connection to the land that ran deeper than memory. She slipped from her bed, her movements guided by an instinct she didn't fully understand. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor as she padded to the door, careful not to wake her family. Outside, the moon hung low and full in the sky, impossibly large and luminous, casting an eerie silver light across the barren landscape. The voice beckoned her toward the horizon, where the cracked earth gave way to the shadowy cliffs that had always marked the boundary of their world. The cliffs rose like jagged teeth against the star-studded sky, their edges sharp and unforgiving in the moonlight. Ayana climbed with trembling hands, her feet finding holds in the ancient rock as if they had been placed there just for her. The song grew louder with each step, pulling her upward with an urgency she couldn't resist. At the summit, she found something impossible, a pool of water shimmering in the moonlight, its surface mirror smooth and impossibly clear. Around its edges grew wildflowers in vibrant purples and yellows, blooms that had no business thriving in the midst of such devastating drought. A figure stood at the edge of the pool, tall and otherworldly. Its form shifted constantly, like water contained in a human shape, catching and reflecting the moonlight in ways that made Ayana's eyes struggle to focus. Its face was smooth and featureless, yet somehow expressive, and its presence radiated a calm, almost maternal warmth that made her want to step closer, despite her fear. "Ayana," the figure said, its voice resonating not in her ears, but directly in her mind, clear as a mountain stream. "You have come." Ayana took a hesitant step forward, drawn by a mixture of fear and fascination. "Who are you?" "I am the Waterbringer," it replied, its form rippling like sunlight on a lake's surface. "I have watched over your people for generations, since before the first stones of your homes were laid. But now I am bound, and your land suffers for it." "Bound?" she asked, the word catching in her throat. "How?" The Waterbringer gestured to the pool with a fluid movement that sent sparkles of light dancing across the rocks. Beneath its crystal-clear surface, Ayana saw a heavy rusted chain anchored to a massive boulder, its links glowing faintly with an otherworldly blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Long ago, your ancestors made a bargain," the spirit said, its voice carrying notes of ancient sorrow. "They bound me to ensure their prosperity, to keep the waters flowing in times of need. But their betrayal, their attempt to control rather than honor, poisoned this land. To free me, to restore the balance, a sacrifice must be made." Ayana's chest tightened as understanding began to dawn. "What kind of sacrifice?" The Waterbringer's voice softened, becoming gentle as morning mist. "One of blood, freely given. The bond must be severed by a life, a gift to restore the balance that was broken so long ago." By dawn, Ayana had returned to the village, her mind racing with the weight of what she had learned. She couldn't shake the image of the chain or the spirit's words from her thoughts. At breakfast, her mother served a meager portion of beans and rice, her face drawn with worry lines that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Koda sat across from Ayana, his small hands clutching his spoon as if it might disappear, just like the water had. "Are we going to leave, Mama?" Koda asked, voicing the fear that had been hanging over them all like a storm cloud. Their mother hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We'll figure something out," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We always do." Ayana's stomach churned as she watched them, the spirit's words echoing in her mind. She couldn't let this happen to her family, to her community. But what could she do? Who could she turn to? The weight of the knowledge pressed down on her like a physical thing. The elders gathered that afternoon under the shade of the community center's sagging roof, their faces grave as they discussed their dwindling options. Ayanna sat quietly in the back, listening as they debated plans to appeal to the government for aid, knowing in her heart that their words were empty. Their voices were heavy with doubt. They'd been ignored before, their pleas for help falling on deaf ears. Finally, gathering all her courage, she spoke up. "What about the water-bringer?" The room fell silent as a grave, the only sound the creaking of old chairs as the elders turned to look at her. They exchanged uneasy glances before Elder Whitefeather, the oldest among them with hair like snow and eyes that had seen nearly a century of seasons, addressed her. "That name has not been spoken in many years," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "It is a legend, child, a story to explain the droughts and floods of old." "It's not a story," Ayanna insisted, rising to her feet. I saw it. Last night. It told me why the land is dying. It's bound by a chain, and we have to free it. It's our only chance." Murmurs rippled through the room, like wind through dry grass. Some dismissive, others curious. Elder Whitefeather leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave as he studied her face. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "then you must understand the cost. The water-bringer does not give freely. Its gifts always come with a price. Are you prepared to pay it?" Ayanna's throat tightened, but she nodded, thinking of Koda's innocent question at breakfast. "If it means saving my brother, saving all of us, I'll do whatever it takes." That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of fire, Ayanna returned to the cliffs. She carried a small deerskin satchel of offerings the elders had instructed her to bring. Sacred cornmeal ground from their last harvest, dried sage gathered under the full moon, and a lock of her own hair cut with a prayer. The water-bringer was waiting, its form shimmering like heat waves in the twilight. "You have decided," it said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Ayanna stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins like ice water. "I'll do what you ask. I'll make the sacrifice." The spirit tilted its head, its liquid form rippling with colors that had no names. "You are brave, child, but the sacrifice must come from the heart. It must be one you love most. Only then can the balance be restored." Her heart plummeted as understanding dawned. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, take me instead. I'll give my life willingly." "It is not your life I require," the water-bringer said gently. "It is your choice. The power to restore balance lies not in the sacrifice itself, but in the choosing." Tears streamed down her face as the weight of the spirit's words settled on her shoulders like a mountain. Koda's face flashed in her mind. His infectious laughter, his boundless curiosity, his unwavering trust in his big sister. The thought of losing him made her feel as though her heart was being torn in two. "There has to be another way," she pleaded, her voice raw with emotion. The water-bringer said nothing, its form growing still as the surface of its pool, waiting for her decision with the patience of mountains. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the sun already burning away the brief coolness of night. Ayanna led Koda to the cliffs under the pretense of exploring, each step feeling like lead in her boots. He followed eagerly, clutching her hand and chattering about the lizards they saw scurrying between rocks. She tried to hide her trembling, forcing smiles and cheerful words that felt like ashes in her mouth. When they reached the summit, Koda gasped at the sight of the pool, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," he said, squeezing her hand. "How is there water up here?" Ayanna knelt beside him, her heart breaking anew at the trust and joy in his face. "Koda, do you trust me?" she asked. her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded without hesitation, his eyes wide and innocent. Always, sister. You're the bravest person I know. Before she could respond, the air shimmered and the water bringer emerged from the pool, its presence silencing the world around them. Coda stepped back, clutching Ayana's arm with fingers that trembled slightly. "What is that?" he whispered, awe and fear mingling in his voice. "It's here to help us," Ayana said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to stay strong. "But we have to help it first." Coda looked up at her, his trust unwavering even in the face of the impossible. Ayana felt her resolve falter, the weight of the choice pressing down on her like all the waters of the world. She couldn't do it. She couldn't sacrifice her brother, not even to save everyone else. The price was too high. "Take me instead," she said, standing defiantly before the spirit. "I choose myself. That's my sacrifice." The Waterbringer studied her for a long moment, its form shifting through colors she had no names for. Finally, it nodded. "Very well," it said, its voice carrying notes of approval and something else, pride, perhaps. It extended a hand formed of liquid light, and Ayana stepped forward, bracing herself for pain or death. But instead of either, she felt a profound warmth wash over her, a sense of peace and rightness unlike anything she'd ever known. The spirit's voice echoed in her mind one last time. "Your love has restored the balance. The land will heal, as will your people. Go now, and remember this lesson. True sacrifice comes not from blood, but from the heart. It is not in the giving of life, but in the willingness to give that power lies." Ayana opened her eyes to find herself standing beside the pool, the Waterbringer gone as if it had never been. The pool shimmered with new life, its water spreading outward in rivulets that carved new paths through the cracked earth. The wildflowers swayed in a gentle breeze that carried the first hint of moisture she'd felt in months, and in the distance, dark clouds gathered on the horizon like a promise. Coda tugged at her hand, his face full of questions. "Ayana, are you okay? What happened?" She knelt and pulled him into a tight embrace, breathing in the scent of sun and dust and brother that was uniquely his. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be okay." As the first drops of rain fell from the gathering clouds, Ayana turned back toward the village, her brother's hand warm and alive in hers, and hope blossoming in her heart like the wildflowers around the sacred pool. She understood now what the Waterbringer had been teaching her all along, that sometimes the greatest power lies not in what we're willing to give up, but in what we're willing to keep, even in the face of impossible choices. The rain fell harder as they made their way down the cliffs, and by the time they reached the village, the parched earth was drinking deeply of the blessed water. Their mother stood in the doorway of their home, her face turned up to the rain, with tears of joy mixing with the droplets. As Ayana watched her family celebrate the return of the water, she silently thanked the spirit for its wisdom and its mercy. The drought ended that day, but the lesson remained, passed down through generations, along with the story of the Waterbringer and the girl who learned that true sacrifice sometimes means having the courage to choose love over fear, life over death, and hope over despair.